So this is what we call a webinar put on by the Blomidon Naturalist Society. And I think it was just last week that I got an email from Alain Belliveau, who is the speaker tonight, and he was talking about the bill, I think it's 57, which is the bill to increase protected areas in Nova Scotia up to 20% by 2030. And Alain, being who he is, immediately jumped on the bandwagon and decided that to look at how much land is actually protected in Kings County, and came up with a very measly small 4 and a bit %. And immediately thought we've got to push Kings County to have 20% protected areas, so be on par for the whole province. And I was delighted that he approached me to put on a webinar for BNS members, and as usual, whoever else is interested can always join. So this evening, Alain Belliveau, who is currently the collections manager for the E.C. Smith Herbarium at the Casey Irving, what are they called? Casey Irving Center.
Environmental Science Center.
Environmental Science Centers. Thank you very much. And Alain, in fact, has a background in forestry, a master's in resource and environmental management. And I'm not sure when he came to Nova Scotia, but he worked for a while for MTRI, and then went on to the Atlantic Canada Conservation Data Center, and is now the, like I said, the collections manager for the E.C. Smith Herbarium. And Alain has prepared a proposal for how Kings County might reach the 20% protected areas. So without further ado, Alain, if you would take over and tell us about your proposal.
All right, thanks, Soren. Thanks for that introduction. Hi, everyone, and welcome to my presentation about protecting Kings County. So it revolves around trying to achieve 20% by 2030, as Soren said. So I'll go over lots of slides about this. First, I'll go over who I am. And I'm hoping that the slides work. There we go. So first and foremost, in the context of this seminar or webinar, I am a resident of Kings County. I've lived here for about 5 or 6 plus years, and I love it here. I wasn't dragged here by anybody. I know my father-in-law is on this webinar, so I would never say such things. But as a resident in Kings County, I really love this place because I get to do all the things that I love to do the most. And that's things like hiking and paddling, hunting and fishing, mapping, exploring, all kinds of things that I do. So I'm wearing that hat as a resident. And as Sora mentioned, I do work at Acadia as a botanist and curator at the herbarium, but I am not wearing that hat for this presentation. So just in case there are any media people on the call or people who might go to the media with this this presentation, just take note of that, because yeah, I think Acadia has enough to deal with right now, and I definitely prefer if somebody does contact me directly for quotes and that sort of thing. So this is kind of the angle that I'm coming to this from. But I'll jump right in, and we'll talk about protected areas and what they are, maybe what they are not. I think I'll leave quite a bit on the table for this webinar in hopes that I get lots of questions at the end. People do their masters, their PhDs, they work careers for decades on this topic alone. So there's no way that I can make it justice or do it justice in these next 30 or 40 minutes. So I'll leave a lot out there, but I hope that you come with your questions there right at the end. So first, what is a protected area? Simply put, it's a defined geographic area that is protected to achieve long-term conservation. And that mostly has to do with nature, but also other things like ecosystem services and even cultural values. And that's an international definition. Some examples include, well, the biggest example is in Greenland, northeastern Greenland. That is the biggest terrestrial protected area in the world. And of course, there are many larger marine protected areas in the world, and I won't be discussing those today, just terrestrial. Here in Nova Scotia, and actually this applies to all of the Maritimes, but our biggest protected areas are the Tobiatic in southwestern Nova Scotia and the Cape Breton Highlands in the northern part of that island. Those two are kind of our crown jewels here in Nova Scotia, but there are some smaller protected areas scattered across the province as well. Things you can do in most protected areas, and I have this slide in just to sort of make sure that everyone is aware that you can still do these things in a protected area. It's not as though people aren't allowed in protected areas. So things you can do include fishing, trapping, hunting, camping, campfires, hiking, and all of those nice things that you would typically do outdoors in a wilderness. Why do we need protected areas? Why can't nature just figure itself out? Well, it's a complicated topic, and this slide and the next one is definitely where I'm leaving a lot on the table. But in general, protecting nature is about having clean water, having pure, clean air, healthy soils, regulating the climate, which is high on a lot of people's lists these days, and of course, biodiversity, which is the type of work that I am in at Acadia, and all kinds of other things that we capture by protecting nature. Yeah, all the way down to squirrels. But the question sometimes that I get is, what are we protecting nature from? And there's, sometimes there's an awkward silence, usually not. I think we're all aware in today's climate, not just the Earth's climate, but political climate, that the Earth is not in such a good shape as it was or could be. And so protecting nature is about making sure some of those ecological functions remain intact, not only for the sake of wildlife and biodiversity, but also for our own sake, because we get so much from nature, including natural resources and the such. So we're protecting it from ourselves, essentially. Are there other options? And one question that I've heard before, and I actually heard before finalizing these slides was, can't we manage the lands in a more balanced way instead of having lots of clear cuts, which you've probably heard of in the news, in some places, and protected areas in others? They seem like two extremes. And the short answer is no. I think people have been trying to do this. I think lots of people have had their heart in the right places in trying to accomplish this more balanced approach. But very, very simply put, it hasn't quite worked out here in Nova Scotia, which is why we have to keep looking at protected areas for a way to conserve nature and all of its values that I mentioned in the previous two slides. Protected areas in Nova Scotia spatially look like this on a map. The first protected areas officially, according to our current legislation, was in 1998. There were other areas that were considered kind of protected, like the Tobiatic as of the 1920s, but it didn't have the legal rigor that our protected area system has today. So it's sort of, some of it is currently protected today, but some of it is dropped off and is being used for wood harvesting and other things. So other than that, 1998 is our first protected area. We have about 12.9% protected, at least according to my latest math. I might be off by a 0.1 or 2. But I always like to include the other stat too, is we have still appropriated 87.1% of the province. So we still have most of the province not protected. And of course, why we're all here is the Kings County gap. Yikes. So we've only got about 4.5% protected, and I'll show you a better map to show that. So despite having, significant areas of public land, which is typically where we have seen protected areas established, a lot of us seem to worship places like Cape Split. I know I do. And we have lots of ecologically progressive citizens. That's just a big word to say, like-minded folks who appreciate nature. And I've certainly met hundreds while living here in Kings County. So there seems to be a lot going for Kings County, but in terms of protected areas, that hasn't really accumulated to a whole lot. And so this is what Kings County looks like, with yellow areas being protected areas and anything else being not protected. So as you can see, the 4.5% makes sense. So how can we fill in that gap? As Thorin mentioned, we now have the Environmental Goals and Climate Change Reduction Act. And in it, it says very specifically that we have, as a province, a legal goal of protecting 20% of Nova Scotia by 2030. And then on the next line, they mention a collaborative protected area strategy due by December 31st, 2023. So less than 2 years from now, there's going to be a strategy, maybe a document, to show the path forward, which is not a linear path by any stretch. But I did enjoy how they included the word collaborative, and I think that's where we all come in, right down to the individual citizen. I think we can all contribute something to this process. So this is my first take at how we could reach 20%. I overshot it slightly, so I think it's around 21%. And so you might be wondering, how the heck did you come up with that? And that's what the next 20 slides are going to be about. But this is sort of a sneak preview to maybe get you hooked and get your attention for the next 20 minutes or so. So the criteria that I used for these proposed protected areas, they're actually not that different from what has been done here in Nova Scotia in the past and throughout the world, really for decades. And so I'm definitely not reinventing the wheel here at all, and basically sticking to evidence-driven or science-driven criteria that have shown to work in the past. So basically, we'll be looking at land ownership, large core areas, connectivity in corridors, water, and rare species and intact forest landscape. I'm kind of going through that list a bit quickly because I'll talk more about them in the next few slides. That was my approach, and there's definitely quite a bit of overlap between those different factors. So they're definitely not mutually exclusive from one another. So this section might seem to be jumping around a little bit to some of you. So first, in terms of land ownership, the first thing that I looked at was crown land, which is not a term that I enjoy very much. I think it's public land. It doesn't belong to the royal family anymore. It's ours, it's yours, it's mine. We all get to enjoy it and benefit from it. And I think that's a good way to think about it. This is where public lands are located. So why are public lands the focus of these sort of processes? There are lots of reasons. There are advantages to that. So they're supposed to be driven by public interest. And please reserve your questions and comments on that for the very end. I know lots of you will think otherwise of that, but that's their intent. And so other advantages include public lands usually have larger parcels. So if you're trying to protect core areas, again, another way that these topics overlap, if you're trying to protect core areas, public lands are a little bit easier to work with for that. And core areas are beneficial, of course, because they can preserve larger populations that can thrive a little bit better. They're a bit more comfortable. Another advantage is that Kings County public lands are significantly less clear-cut than private lands. And I'll have a slide to show that in a few minutes. A disadvantage is that even if we protect all public lands in Kings County, we still don't have enough for 20%. And the other thing too is that public lands tend to be, they tend to have poor soils. And there's a pretty simple reason for that is back in the 17 to 1800s, when people were settling the area, they would want to go and settle and farm the nice soil areas. So those were all taken up. And what was left is a whole bunch of areas with poor soils, and those were sort of kept as public or crown land at the time. And that's the main reason that there's still public lands. And so one thing that has an impact on is that you will find different species and ecosystems on poor soils than you will on richer soils. And so even if you captured all of these public lands, you would still probably miss, who knows, dozens or hundreds of different species or ecosystems, or some of those values that I listed in previous slides. And yeah, some of which you would only get with private land. So that is a disadvantage. Now, moving on to private land, it's pretty easy to show why protecting private land can be really hard. We've got a map here with different property parcels from the Viewpoint website. And imagine trying to turn this into a large protected area that is meaningful to biodiversity and paddling and hiking and all those things. It just won't happen here. And it's not that I'm picking on New Minas, but I'm just trying to show the point that this is really hard. And even as you get into rural Nova Scotia, you still have lots and lots of smaller parcels and maybe landowners that don't want to sell their lands for all kinds of good reasons. And so the challenges with private lands are definitely many and really hard to overcome. So like I said, one advantage is they have better soils. So you might have different values that you can't capture with public lands, but the disadvantages are many. So smaller parcels, they are more clear-cut or disturbed in Kings County and developed as well. They can be expensive to buy. And sometimes we just don't have the funds or the budgets provincially to buy them. Conversion can take a while. Lands are often still surrounded by private lands and all of the different threats that come with that. So the disadvantages are many for private lands. So if you've heard of the Nova Scotia Nature Trust or the Nature Conservancy of Canada, these are the types of lands that they try to work with the landowners of private lands to protect areas, and you can just appreciate how much work they have to put into those types of protection projects. So kudos to them for all their hard work. But for our vision here, what I am proposing to the provincial government, mostly focusing on public land for all the reasons that I just mentioned. If we look for large core areas, and this is where I try to do a little bit of markup here. So if we look for core areas, one place that would be terribly, terribly challenging would be to find core areas in the Annapolis Valley on the floor itself. So in terms of bigger picture protected areas, I don't think we're going to find core areas on the valley floor. And that's not at all to say that we should not pursue, getting areas protected on the valley floor. Not at all. I'm just talking about big core areas. And then next, I was going to look at the North Mountain, and I would say this is sort of in the middle. lots and lots and lots of private land, but there are bigger parcels and, you know, still big chunks of forests and ravines. So there's some opportunity there for core areas. But as you can probably guess by now, the main area in Kings County for a large core area to be protected would be, you know, this large bottom southern end, basically the southern half of the county. And then there's some opportunity up here with the two capes. But again, there's a bit of private land up there, so it's not as ideal. But connectivity between the capes and near the capes is a neat little opportunity that I couldn't ignore. Next, and I won't talk too much about this one, is connectivity and corridors. So basically how wildlife species go from one place to another, and that can be very local, you know, from one lake to another or one hardwood forest to another, or it can be even bigger than that. So traveling across counties like, you know, like bobcats or lynx or moose or those types of species. So connectivity in Kings County is mainly, I would say, between Cloud Lake Wilderness area, which is on the left here, and then some other protected areas in Hanson, Halifax County. So if we're thinking bigger picture for connectivity, that's the connection that we want to focus on so that we can, you know, maybe you've seen it in the news, you know, trying to get those moose around so they can share and spread their genetics, and maybe we have some hope for moose on mainland Nova Scotia. But this is what I had in mind when thinking of connectivity. But not just that. Another feature that I think is really important for connectivity is water. And so the next map shows how there are basically, I'd say, 3 prominent watersheds in the lower half of Kings County. So there's Gaspereau and the upper Annapolis, and then the upper LaHave. You can see pretty clearly how some of these connect by waterways, bogs, lakes, rivers and streams, swamps, and the likes. And lots of species do use these habitat types in that way. They just stick to the same habitat type and just sort of wander around. So this is a really important feature for connectivity, and not even to mention all the values that we get from water, you know, all the bogs that filter water, you know, all the rivers that have the fish that we go and catch, and et cetera, et cetera. One example of this, specifically to the mapping, I thought I'd show you one is, for example, I forget exactly where this is, but you can clearly see, you know, these big bog systems here and over here. Lots of big bogs in Kings County, really impressive. And then lakes and rivers and streams over here. So when I was doing the mapping, I did go through all of the county, and this was a bit of a manual process for me. It took quite a while, but I went through that and turned it into lands that could be proposed as protected areas. And for example, there are places that I would avoid, and that would be things like, you know, this little bit of cottage country down here. That would be impossible to protect, and there wouldn't really be much meaning to that. But in their backyard, you know, lots of bogs, rivers, lake shores, all that stuff. So that's kind of a hands-on approach to how I did the mapping. And species at risk and other species of conservation, I did consider just the species that I know of personally in this area. Again, another concrete example here. Me and one other person found black ash right here. And this doesn't happen that often because black ash usually grows in places with decent soil. But as it happened, this area was actually public lands. So this was kind of an easy one to include this block as a proposed protected area because it would capture the tremendous value of black ash or Wisco. So lots of cultural meaning or value to this species. And just luck of the draw that they fall within public land. So I captured that one too. And last but definitely not least, I know that I think there are some people from the Healthy Forest Coalition on this seminar. So these next few slides are kind of for you. Although I'm sure you've seen it all before. So this was just to compare how public lands seem to have a lot less clear cutting than private lands do. The green areas on this map are public land, and then the non-green areas are private land, and then the dark red is clear cuts within the last few decades. And so you can see it's quite a striking contrast between those two land ownership types. So just another vote for focusing on those public lands. And here's another slide to show it some more. There are some clear cuts on public land here, but not nearly as many. And as you can see, my red, I'll just change the pen color here, but the red clear cut areas, I think they only go up to 2017 on this map. I do have more updated map, just not here, but as you can see, there has been more clear cutting since 2017. So in a way, time is sort of ticking to be able to preserve these areas with lots of intact forests, which has tremendous value for all kinds of things. Again, like I listed in my first few slides. Yeah, that kind of shows you how much of Kings County has been clear cut, especially on large pieces of private land. So you're not really talking much about, the small 100-hectare landowner. These are huge parcels of thousands of hectares, and so this is essentially industrial forestry. And I was actually a bit surprised last year. I spent a little bit of time in that larger public land block. And yeah, this is what I found in one spot. So old growth hardwood forest with lichen species of conservation concern. So there's still some really good, valuable, intact forest in this area. But like I said, time is sort of not on our side here. I don't know how old those trees would be, but they would be at least 100 years old each. So back to the map, that's what the 21% looks like. I know we kind of zoomed in and out there for some of those more specific examples of how I produced this map. The yellow is public lands. So I've kind of divided it up, and this is just from my own personal notes, into two crown blocks or public land blocks. So there's the Shell Camp Lake and the Gully Lakes public lands. And then the orange color is almost all industrial forestry land. So I've kind of targeted that. There is a precedent in Nova Scotia of making large purchases of industrial forestry land. And so again, I'm just going with what has occurred in Nova Scotia, what is possible, what is feasible, and putting that out there in my letter to the provincial government. So speaking of that letter, what have I asked for? And I'm not at all telling anyone what to do here, except to participate in the democratic process as much as you can. It doesn't matter what your perspective is. I just hope everyone gets involved in some way. So in my letter, I've acknowledged the government's action on this. So having the Environmental Sustainability Act in place and having a really good goal in mind. I think those are all really good things and great steps forward. And then saying that the collaborative approach is really the best approach forward. And this is my take at trying to help them with their big protected areas goals. So this is my attempt at collaborating with government. So what did I ask for? Well, I just asked that the Minister of the Department of Environment include the information that I provide for further review and consideration as they go through this process. So that's kind of a no-brainer. Number two is I have asked for a moratorium or a stop on cutting on some of the larger public land blocks just so the democratic process can ensue. So basically saying, whoa, can we make a more sound and community-based decision on these public lands before the lands change significantly? And maybe they become something that few people would want to protect in the first place. But sort of, saying, let's take a break here. Let's think about this more. And then number 3 is asking for an increase in the provincial budget for buying back private lands. Like I said, there usually is a budget provincially, but it's not very big. The province has made bigger purchases in the past, so we'll need much more of that if we want to protect a good 20% across Nova Scotia, but particularly here in Kings County. And I mentioned the term general here. So my letter here that I wrote to the province has about 1% of the details that I've offered to you in this set of slides. So I think it's important to kind of go along with the process a little bit. It's very vague and general right now. I think they're looking for general direction, and they're looking to hear from people on a very general scale. And so all the details that I provided here in this slideshow, I will hopefully be able to follow up on those later during the process. But at this point, it's just about saying, hey, we like that this is your vision. I think it's our vision too. And here's how we broadly think this could happen. And so that's kind of the perspective I'm taking here. I don't want to micromanage this from the get-go. It's very broad. And I think we should try to just encourage each other quite a bit at the start. So my letter sort of took that approach on. And yeah, what happens next? So the collaborative process ensues. Comments from the public are considered by the Department of Environment because they have to. They're public servants, and this is a public process. So send a letter, and they are obligated to listen to you. There may be a formal public consultation session before or after that strategy is developed. I don't know exactly when that might happen, but I'm sure there'll be some opportunities for very specific consultation for some of these lands across Nova Scotia. And I'm sure there will also be Mi'kmaq engagement at some point. I don't know much about that part of the process. And of course, the strategy is supposed to be completed by December 2023, and then further deliberations for some areas being considered. And you can put an exclamation mark after this because they'll be deliberated and deliberated and deliberated and then deliberated some more. I hope there'll be some protection of some areas before 2030. But yeah, by 2030, we should have 20% protected. And don't be surprised if it's like 2032 or 3 or something like that. That things don't move very quickly sometimes. And that's kind of brings me to my next slide, is that there are challenges along the way. So if somebody does want to be involved in this, whether it's letter writing or trying to promote the process in other ways, there are challenges. So I've listed some of them here with some solutions. They're not solutions that work 100% of the time, but they're very general solutions that can work some of the time. So I listed them here just for having a more upbeat slideshow and not just saying, here's how much you're going to struggle, the end. No, I think there's always a way through this, especially if we work together, we collaborate as the process is intended to do. So first off, politics are really slow, but I've learned that patience and persistence goes a long way. So we're talking about 8 years, maybe even more than 8 years here. And we're talking about a lot of, probably a lot of frustrations along the way, slow political wheels turning, et cetera, et cetera. So I've learned that persistence is probably the best solution here. It's just to stay with it. The next one is nature deficit disorder. Some of you, I'm sure, have heard of this before. It's just maybe you might be working with people that might not know much about, say, biodiversity or conservation areas. So I think it's good to be respectful. I think we live in a society that encourages this disorder, with air quotation marks around it. And it's not everybody's fault if they don't know everything about ecosystems and species and all that stuff that you might know something about. So a good rule of thumb there is just to keep things simple. A lot of people say grade 6 language. Whether it's, if you go to if you ask a MLA, can you protect this one rock on a lake that has this super rare lichen? They might relate more to saying, hey, I wonder if this lakeshore on this beautiful lake could be protected for its aesthetic properties or something like that. So I think keeping things simple is often very, very good thing to do. Next, I mentioned inflexibility in resource extraction industries. And so I think there's always room for respect there, as tough as it might be at times. I've met lots of people who look at trees for just one value, and that is it. And tree species, the commercial ones, they represent maybe 10 species out of 50,000 species in our ecosystems in this region. So it can feel very frustrating at times, but I think respect is key there, and dialogue, and things like I mentioned, large parcels of industrial forestry private lands, and the concept of potentially purchasing some of those. When I think about that, I think about people losing their jobs, and I think that's a fair way to think about it. And so if we were to approach purchasing large private lands like that, we do have to consider the economic impact, and things like having rehabilitation programs for people to get another degree or a diploma, to switch to other industries, or to have compensation for people in some way, to make up for the losses that they might experience. So I think respect goes a long way there. Dialogue does too, although you might run into walls occasionally. If somebody doesn't want to talk about the stuff, then it's good to just leave it at that. Coordination. So what I mean by that is, even within a group with lots of people that share the same values, you might have some disagreements. So it's all about, and I feel like a life coach here, but I'm really not. I'm just telling you all about my struggles in the past, and just a few basic things that I've learned along the way, because some of them are hard. But as a group, it's good to keep trying to find that overlap and not let the little things bog you down. Dialogue is always really important. I've been really impressed by what the Blomidon Naturalist Society has been able to do these last few years. So I'm sure that most of you know all about this. And last but not least, sometimes I hear people say, well, I don't really know the area well enough, to write a letter or to promote anything. Well, I think you probably do now that you've seen these slides, but if you still feel that way, I would highly encourage you to go explore. Maybe you're a birder and you can go find some Canada warblers and all-sided flycatchers and put those on the map for us, because that's really, really important data for us to consider when we're trying to identify places to protect. If there's a species at risk, like Canada warbler, then government will want to know about it so that they can potentially protect it. So my advice there is just go explore, even if it's for a few hours. A lot of these places are fairly accessible with roads, and you'll have lots of fun, I'm sure. So now that I've done the preachy part of the slides, I just wanted to show you a couple of pictures of Kings County that I've taken just in the last year, not even a year. This is just in the last 8 months or so. And just all of the things that I value in this county. And a big part of the reason why I'm putting forward this proposal is I care about this area, and I want to see it do well in the long term. So yeah, without further ado, I want to thank everybody, and I think we'll have some time for questions. I'll let Soren take it from here. Hi again, everybody. I just had a couple more things to follow up to the seminar. There were things that I didn't know enough about to feel confident to talk about them, but after the seminar was over, I thought, shoot, I should have said something about that. But the first one was what are called Mi'kmaq forestry initiatives. There are two in Nova Scotia, equaling about 20,000 hectares or so. There's one in Digby County and one in southwestern Hants County. But these are opportunities on public lands, collaborative opportunities between the Mi'kmaq community and the province of Nova Scotia to build Mi'kmaq capacity to manage and utilize forests, but also to enable Mi'kmaq communities to express their vision and values for stewardship over the land. And so yet another way that we can manage our landscape differently. So I wanted to make sure that you knew about that. You can Google it, find out more. Another one that I wanted to mention was Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, or IPCAs. And just like the forestry initiatives, these are sort of new. At least they're sort of new to me, so I don't know that much, and that's why I didn't feel confident to sort of jump on the opportunities to mention these yesterday. But I brushed up a little bit on them, and so that's why I'm telling you about them now. But the IPCA, which is a internationally designated type of protected area, looks to achieve biodiversity conservation, enhance local livelihoods, adapt to climate change and the sorts, but also trying to achieve a reconciled relationship with the country's Indigenous peoples. So that's a pretty big added bonus. So it has similarities with protected areas that I had talked about in the seminar, but in the spirit and practice of reconciliation. So if you Google IPCA, you can find out lots more about that. So yeah, my apologies for not mentioning those. And there are other ways to manage our land, and I certainly don't know all of them, and I acknowledge that. But I wanted to make sure I mentioned these because I thought they were important, because they are starting to show up here in Nova Scotia. That's all for now. I hope you got something out of this, and see you later.
Alain, thank you so much for a very excellent presentation of your proposal. I think you have hit on many of the important aspects of why we should protect areas and one way to go about it. So thank you so much. Now, there are quite a few people on this call, 56 of you. So I wonder if you might, the best way to handle the discussion, I think, is if people could raise their hand. And if you are not familiar with Zoom, at the very bottom, there is a row of various icons, and there's one called reactions. And in the reactions, you can raise your hand. When I see you raising your hand, I will ask you to unmute and then ask your question. And depending on the number of questions, I think maybe we could limit it to one per person, and then we could get back to if you have a second question. But it all depends, I guess, on how many questions there are. So without further ado, if you, and I'm not totally sure how I might raise it. Okay, I see Mike Gill has raised his hand. Mike, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure. Thanks, Soren. And thanks, Alain, for that's a great presentation. I'm just wondering if you could offer some thoughts around the fact that the provincial strategy, of course, is provincial, not county-led. And so they're looking at it at the provincial scale, and they're using various criteria to consider the selection and placement of protected areas. Do you have any thoughts on how you would align some of the analysis that you did to speak that language to the provincial so that we do get areas within Kings County prioritized in that process? Thanks.
Right. No, that's a really good question. And it's a really, really complicated one too. So I have to think about it for a sec here. I think in the past, provincially, they have used different ecological units. So these big areas that sort of represent places that have similar bedrock types and ecosystem types. And those are either called eco districts or natural landscapes is the other definition. So I did purposefully not use those in this analysis because I think there's a sense among some of my colleagues within this process that we've maybe gone as far as we can with those sort of delineations and trying to capture representative pockets of each one of these bigger ecological units. And so I avoided using it here because we've gone as far as we can in some areas with that type of framework. And I'm guessing that the province might see it that way a little bit more along this process as well. And so I'm not explaining this very well, but basically, if you can find intact forests in Nova Scotia, that has tremendous value to the point of trumping, those older mechanisms that we would have used to map out places that we were kind of lacking this or lacking that. And so I think if we are communicating to the province, a lot of it will ride on saying, here are some intact forests. This is incredibly rare. And of course, all the other things that I mentioned, but I think intact forests and the core areas, to a certain degree, connectivity, those line up well with a lot of provincial priorities. For example, the province has to protect species at risk. And so those values definitely work towards protecting species at risk. I know that some of these public lands do have species at risk, like the Canada warbler that I mentioned earlier. And so the mapping that I provided would protect those. So to try and speak the provincial language, I think is impossible. I think it's a moving target. But I think intact forest and species at risk, they go a long way in trying to, if you're sort of making a case for protected areas in this region. If you go ahead and you say we should protect the Annapolis Valley floor, you won't get too far. So that's why I had a lot of focus on the southern half of Kings County, sorry, with all of the values that I mentioned. But I think intact forests and species at risk are sort of where I would land after thinking about that really complicated question for a few minutes. Thanks.
Thanks. Alain, maybe could you stop sharing your slides, because then we can go to gallery view, and I think it'll be easier for people. Then I can see more people on the screen, and I can see hands up, and
Sure.
I think other people will benefit from that. So excellent, thanks.
Yep.
I see Carol Vandercloot, your hand is up. If you unmute yourself, then you can ask your question. Maybe that hand has been up for quite a while, actually. Alain, I don't see any hands up right now, so I might jump in.
Sure.
And say, so this is for Kings County. And I see that there are a couple of councillors on the call here or on the Zoom meeting. Have you approached the the Kings County municipality to kind of maybe, it would seem getting them on side would be an excellent idea.
Yeah, no, I haven't, but I do know that they have been approached already in the past, I think the
Okay.
last couple of years or so. And that those discussions have been between provincial government, the Department of Environment, and municipalities. So I think with this little letter and this little promotion of protected areas, I was hoping to stay out of very specific conversations and forums, in part because I've heard that some of them are already ongoing, and I don't want to, just jump right in. I think once I send this letter and provincial government knows that I'm keen to help, I can be brought in to help with any sort of discussions, whether it's about local biodiversity or values and that sort of thing. So I haven't, and that's the main reason why. Just it's nice. I have heard that those discussions have already occurred in the past, and
Right.
I think a couple people on this call know of those discussions. So I guess I would just say that I'm here to help if there's any way that I can.
Right. And I think, like, certainly the Blondin Naturalist Society is totally behind you on this. And in fact, Caroline Bedot will be drafting a letter on behalf of the BNS so that we can support your move. And one of the things that the BNS that we've been talking about, and which is on the agenda for this, I'll say this winter, is to approach the various level of governments and indicate how we have a lot of expertise within our group that can help in precisely a process that you're proposing to protect, to protect areas, and certainly for lots of other things like endangered species and species at risk, and you name it. So I think there's a huge opportunity here to really promote this in Kings County. I think I see two hands up, or at least there's a hand up with a 2 beside it. But I don't.
I see Carol has her hand up.
Yeah, but that hand came up very early right when you started, and I couldn't really respond to it. So I think that was something at the very beginning that person, Carol, wanted to talk about. And Carol, if you can hear me, and if you still have a question, then unmute yourself, and he'll ask you to unmute. Maybe that'll help. And then ask your question.
Maybe she's just waving hi.
Maybe she's just waving, who knows?
Hi, Carol.
Right. Are there any other questions? And those of you who know me know that I always have lots of questions. Oh, I think Celeste has his hand up.
Hi, Alain.
Yes.
Thank you, Soren. Alain, good to see you. Great presentation. I have a question. Just looking at the recent advocacy work that I've been involved with Owl's Head, and more recently with Nova Scotia Power's request for increasing rates. One of the things that was really helpful in responding to both of those situations was a core information package. And I'm wondering, as a landowner here in Kings County, is there a way that we can get a text narrative and maybe a couple of supplementary images that we could use in some kind of a form or template to send our own letters during this process? And if that's the case, is there a time frame within which you feel you'd feel comfortable putting this together? Because I think that what I watched in both of those situations was that as more and more people began to become educated, they were able to actually advocate. And we're aligned with a government right now that has a very strong mandate towards the things that you're talking about. So I'm curious what might be done.
Yeah, I was hoping that Caroline, Soren, and I could work on that, and the Blomidon Natural Society could offer up a similar package.
Yeah.
I think my letter is very specific to me, and I think that would be everybody's case, and but the core information would be the same for all. So I could provide that, and yeah, you guys could include it on your website or somewhere.
Well, you certainly have the expertise to do the GIS analysis, I think, which you've done a lot of the work already that you would think would go into deciding what areas should be protected. And not everybody can do that, but we can certainly, given this presentation, support that approach. And indeed, this is being recorded, and it will be up so that people can look at it, a couple of hours after we shut down here, because then I'll post it. Well, it may take me until tomorrow, but it'll be up, and then people can certainly look at it again. But I think it makes great sense. Now, there's another hand up, I see. Or Celeste, is that still your hand, maybe? Oh, it disappeared. Okay. I think you mentioned something really important, and that is that the valley floor has very little protected areas, if any. Well, there's a few scattered places, and there are probably some private landowners that have left areas alone. But I think we have to, agricultural land is invariably on soils that are highly fertile, because that's where you can do, conduct agriculture. And those areas, like you mentioned, were also the most species rich in all kinds of species. And who knows what we have lost. But I think it would be interesting to see if, so one approach here, I think, would be to seek landowners in the valley floor who would be interested in protecting whatever areas that they have, small or large, because those areas could, in fact, be significantly important in terms of all kinds of species. And that's right across the whole world. Like agriculture right around the world is in the most productive land, and they've been cleared, and and we have monocultures there. So I think that would be interesting to try to see what could be done there. Maybe not in terms of the 20%, I don't know, but certainly as an addition to this. Okay, I see Ken has his hand up. Ken, why don't you unmute yourself and go ahead?
Yeah, hi. I just
Hi,
wanted
Ken.
to mention this will come down to quietly presenting to a multiple group of audiences, including the municipality of Kings County, the various towns and villages within the county, in order to build a consensus as to how things should proceed. And I think Alain has made a really good start here. So, but again, there's many steps, as we found when we were doing the little bit of work on the Kentville Ravine. So that's my comment.
Thanks, Ked.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think getting together and going through all of this information has a ton of value too. I guess my approach here is, like, within the context of these slides, was just to exercise my own right as a citizen to try and share and collaborate. But I have been part of bigger groups in the past that come together at a table and discuss all of these things, and those can be really productive too. So definitely a two-pronged approach is what I would encourage there.
Yeah. Yes, and no doubt a huge challenge, as we are seeing with the current issues around, like the Healthy Forest Coalition's attempt to, promote the Leahy report, and especially the ecological forestry, which seems not to be moving at the rate that many of us would like to see it move at.
Yeah. And one more thing to add to that, I never even mentioned it, but the proposal to purchase more of those large industrial forest lands, even within in the confines of public land. I didn't map all of it out, and so if you'd see this on the map, you'd say, why didn't you map it all out? What are the other little bits about?
Right.
I think there is still room for forestry in Kings County, lots of it. And one aspect that I would like to see encouraged a bit more in the future is the concept of a community forest in Kings County, whether that's an extension of the one that already exists down in Annapolis County, which has done really well, and seems to make a lot fewer people angry. So I think there are other methods for us to conserve land beyond just protected areas, although this seminar was about protected areas. But if wherever we land in 8+ years, I just wanted to make sure that community forests are considered also. So if it seems like too much to take away some forested lands for protected areas, people want to see them as working lands, then I think there's quite an appetite in Kings County and across Nova Scotia to see those lands managed at least a little bit differently. And so I think my proposal still kind of has room for that. It's a bit of a broad stroke in favor of protected areas, but I just wanted to make that point, that it's not a silver bullet, these protected areas.
No, not at all. And I think you did raise it all in the beginning, that about, doesn't need to be protected if areas are managed in a very sensitive ecological fashion. And I think the debate often comes down to forestry, clear cutting, or not at all. And I think that's unfortunate, because forests have all kinds of resources, and there are lots and lots of good examples of how a forest, like how you can still get value out of a forest, yet leaving essentially the forest standing. Mm-hmm. And that we often miss. And I think it becomes this all or nothing approach, which is, really very sad, I think.
It's polarizing.
It's polarizing. And what often happens, unfortunately, is that when the province decided on the 12% protected areas way back in the late 90s, late 80s, early 90s, the response in the forestry industry was, well, we'll just have to be more intensive on the rest of the land, which is the sad way to go, which is the polarization that we really don't need. So good. Any other questions, or just discussion points that people would like to raise? Let me see.
I do see some questions.
Oh, there's a couple of hands up. Oh, Caroline, I see your hand is up.
Less of a question and more just of a comment. First, thanks, Alain, for the presentation, everyone for joining us tonight. I think I just wanted to sort of circle back and highlight a bit of what Celeste said earlier too, in just hearing all of our conversations, just the real power of collective action. I think, I'm feeling it recently, like, there can be a lot of letter writing to do, and sometimes it can feel tiring or, I don't know, overwhelming sometimes. And so I'm really reassured by kind of all of us here tonight, listening, thinking, engaging, and, prepared to kind of collectively write. I certainly know us at the BNS and the board are going to be drafting something, and just to think about timelines too, like the timeline for the protected areas strategy is 2023, but the government in Bill 57, the Environmental Goals and Climate Change Reduction Act, that this target is enumerated in, has of course many other criteria, and one of which is that the government needs to have a climate change plan by the end of 2022. So there's a little bit of these overlapping staggered timelines that we have the Leahy report for 2023. And so I think there's also potential to kind of, we're starting the conversation early, like let's not wait till, into 2023 to really get the gears rolling. I think we can of course start to push a lot of the desire for protected lands kind of in midst of the climate change discussion too. Of course, a lot of these big forested protected areas, really important carbon sinks too. And so I think there's a lot of kind of overlapping potential for citizen dialogue and collaborative action. So that's all I kind of wanted to say, that I'm just inspired and happy, of course, to support that in any way if possible, and grateful for everyone for that work. So yeah, thanks for Celeste for that point. I just wanted to amplify that once more.
And I'm just looking at the written comments in the chat.
Yeah.
The first one being by, and I wonder if Soren or Caroline, if you could go through the chat.
Yeah, I think we should do that.
Yeah, and I'll just go over the first couple, and then you can fill me in on the rest as I. But the first one was by John Burka, and I feel really bad for not acknowledging that we are in Mi'kmaq territory, the unceded lands of the Mi'kmaq.
And I'm the one who usually do that. And yeah, I apologize. I was so excited about this Zoom meeting, this seminar. And in fact, that my power came on only 20 minutes or so before it started, because I thought I was going to miss it, that I forgot to acknowledge that. So yes. And then there were some, I think, questions that were answered by other people. And let me go down. I think Joel Hurdle talked about fire roads are a great way to get in to see the lakes and swamps, and great for winter camping. So I think that was in response to you suggesting that people should discover Kings County, because it really is, it's so diverse, Kings County. Yeah, you can encounter anything here, basically. And let's see here. Pat Kelly said that there's a great map, and what I can do, I can post that link. It's novascotia.ca, and well, it's a long thing. It's about protected areas, and it's a map of protected areas in Nova Scotia. Alison Scott Butler, Alain, amazing presentation. Is there any possibility of protecting the deep ravines around the creeks running into the Bay of Fundy, where the large forest harvesting cannot go, like Woodland Creek and Ross Creek, but there may be many others?
That's a good question. I mean, ultimately, I hope it would depend on the specific landowners and their situation and how they feel about either selling the land or donating their land for conservation. I think there is one little chunk of Crown land. Oh, it's west. I think it's in Baxter Harbor. So that one, if it's not protected already, would be fairly high priority. I don't know exactly the situation for that one, so don't quote me on any of this. But otherwise, it would depend on private landowners and working with them. I did highlight a couple of pieces of land in that area. For example, near Ross Creek, there's a really large piece of land owned by, I think it's a developer. But it hasn't had any development yet. So it's large, which is unusual, and it's still intact. We found species at risk on that piece of land. So I did flag that one to look into, but yeah, it depends on the private landowners involved. And, to a certain degree, how much money is put into trying to, convince, a landowner to split their lands and protect some and keep the rest, that sort of thing. So it's a lot of it has to do with money too.
Yeah, I see there's the message from Lexi Misner, I think. I hope I remember it right. And that is saying that this would be a great presentation for the council, for the municipality of King's Council. So maybe you're going to be approached by them to give this, or they can see the recording of it.
Yeah, I can do that.
Yeah. Mike Gill says this is a very useful spatial platform that can inform areas of intact forest and areas that have undergone recent forest cover. This is maintained by the University of Maryland, and you can consume the spatial data on their platform. You can consume. Anyway, that's another, it's the Global Forest Watch platform that what people can look at, I think he's referring to. It's 30-meter resolution and based on Landsat data, so it's current and a decent enough resolution. I will send that link out later. And here's Councillor Joel Hurdle. Alain, I would invite you to reach out to our municipal clerk to make this presentation to council at our committee of the whole. So I think there are 4 municipal councillors, I think, on this Zoom meeting, and certainly 2 of them seemed eager that you give it. So
what's up with the other 2?
Well, maybe they just haven't agreed, and maybe they haven't gotten there yet.
I think, I mean, I should say too that I'm doing all of this, you know, as a volunteer.
Yes, yes.
I think the best way would be maybe they can contact me through you.
Yeah, maybe we can collaborate in giving this. Donna Crossland says, excellent strategic thinking, Alain. A simple widening of riparian corridors are supposed to be reviewed from the Independent Forest Review. Leahy would increase protected areas percentage along with connectivity. Yeah, Allison, perhaps there could be some coordination with the development plan for Kings County, because if there is buy-in and consistency between King's development plan and the request to the province. And then John Berger says, perhaps share this with John Lohr and Keith Irving. Emily Lutz, thumbs up for the idea of a community forest. And then Donna, again, the Working Woodland Trust Initiative may also be helpful with supplementing land protection in this area. And Mike Gill again, worth noting that there is growing momentum for the 30 by 30 initiative. 70 countries have signed on to commit up to 30% protected areas coverage by 2030. Nova Scotia should follow suit. Donna then says this in response to harvesting can take place in forests and without clear cutting, and that is to maintain continual cover, which is an excellent point because continual cover is important. And then Allison says, we may consider ourselves to be in cyberspace, so you can be forgiven, Soren, for failing to mention all the unceded land we collectively occupy. Well, thanks, Allison. And then
it's awfully hard to read those chat notes.
It is in the yes. Let's see. There's a bunch of Alternative Tuesdays committee.
I think somebody asked how large was large, and I think that might have been in reference to the private land on the Fundy Coast.
Right.
And so the few that I have mapped out as, you know, potentially someone could pursue and talk to the landowner in a really nice way and with a pocket full of change is like a, you know, it's at least 100 acres or bigger. Below that just gets to be I mean, below that, sure, properties would be valuable, but it's just like I was saying before, it gets to be a lot of energy. So for what people can put into it, so larger, the better, just in our financially squeezed society.
Yeah.
But I think I just measured one at about 500 hectares or so, and the other one's about 300 or 400.
Right. Alain, I see there are two hands up. Paul Pross, if you unmute, oh, you are unmuted. Go ahead and ask your question.
No, I haven't. I'd like to ask Alain if he ran into any of the people he spoke to, referred to the Community Conservation Easements Act, which was passed in 2012, was to encourage private landowners to engage in conservation. I think it might also have been the base for the Medway River, the Medway community forest. But I wonder that the act has had very little attention, and I'm wondering if anyone expressed any interest in taking advantage of it.
I think there certainly is interest. There might be a lack of appropriate resources to follow up with that kind of legislation. So trying to get more easements for like provincially for more protected areas. There are also mechanisms through the Nova Scotia Nature Trust and the Nature Conservancy of Canada for similarly styled easements. And they all count as protected areas. Like they match the criteria or the definitions of international protected areas. So they're all mechanisms to help with private land easement slash protection. But I agree that there'd be some usefulness to seeing those things promoted a bit more. And I think it is just an understaffed fill in the blank. So Department of Environment or Nature Trust or Nature Conservancy. And there are other trusts in the province as well, but it's understaffed, underfunded. I think that's probably the big story there.
Good. Celeste, is your hand up?
Yeah, I
yes.
just have a quick question, and I may have missed it at the beginning, Alain. When you talk about public lands, what is meant by public lands?
They used to be, and they still are, mostly called crown lands. So these are lands that are owned by the government, but for us all, the public. So in the past, and it's sort of been like this historical trend towards using these lands for resource extraction. And in Nova Scotia, we've certainly had a challenge, maybe getting out of that a little bit and looking at the lands from a more of a multiple use perspective. And so we're still faced with that challenge. There's so much from the resource extraction industries that is just anchored in, and we're still having a hard time pulling that anchor up. But they're there for all of us, from the individual.
I'm curious, in your
Yep.
map, why are so many of the maps that you showed where those large green areas are, why is it not showing harvesting in those areas? Why are they still green?
That's a really good question, and I was wondering the same too. I mean, there's a lot of communication within the forestry industry. So my guess was that to keep feeding the local mills, there was enough wood fiber on those large private land holdings. And maybe on those public lands, which historically were burned and affected in other ways, maybe the forest was a little bit younger and just not as ideal for forest harvesting. That would apply to some of those public lands, not all. There are some nice old forests there too, like the ones that I showed in the picture. But my feeling now is that because, and this is just pure guess, if there's a forestry expert here, just jump on in. But my feeling was that these large private land holdings have been gutted in a sense. You saw the map. Forests have been taken out from those areas pretty heavily. And so if a few mills around this area or across the province, because wood can go a long way. If they needed the wood fiber, then the next place to look at would be those public lands. And maybe that's why we're seeing more clear cutting there in the last 5 to 8 years, I would say. That was just my guess.
So the timing is right. Is there any correlation or is there any research in those green areas for the biodiversity elements that would help us to make the case in our individual letters, whether that be species diversity, whether it be particular species of butterfly, whether it be wildlife corridors, whether it be the reemergence of fisher, whether it be lichens?
Yes. Much of those areas of public land have so far been not surveyed very well, to be honest. But the little bit of data that we have for those areas do suggest that there are many species at risk occurrences in those areas. There would be some old forests, there would be for sure, there are large wetlands that would support some of those wildlife species that you mentioned. I would definitely encourage you to focus on species at risk as much as possible. Although mentioning all species is always great. The thing with species at risk is that they're written in law. We're supposed to protect them here in Nova Scotia, and the province has been taken to court for not doing a great job on that. So we can sort of keep that fire lit underneath the province and keep saying, we got to make sure we protect these species so they don't disappear. That's a line that we never want to cross. And so there are species at risk in those areas, and you could send me an email. I could chat more specifically about some of those species, because that would make this meeting really long to go over species, even though that's what I love to do the most. But we could chat more about that later.
Thank you.
Thanks. I wonder if, unless there are there any last questions? Paul, did I just hear you?
Oh, I'm sorry, Soren, I forgot to unmute.
Oh, to mute. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I don't see any more hands up. And I'm sure this discussion could carry on for much longer, and in a sense, I'm sure it will, because this is something that we will be focusing on for the next year and 11 months, I guess. And certainly the BNS is going to be active in this area. And I'm sure, Alain, if people have specific questions, would they be able to email you and with suggestions, or
yeah, for sure. Yep.
That? Yeah.
Like I said, get my Gmail address through Soren, if you can share it with the participants, and
yeah,
I'll do my best to respond. Like I said, this is volunteer work, and a lot of this takes a lot of time.
Takes a lot of time. Well, I know
it takes me a while.
Yes. Anyways, I don't see any more hands up. So, Alain, I want to thank you so much for, in fact, volunteering to give this presentation. And I think that's an amazing initiative that you've taken on. But I know this is something that is really close to you and important to you, as it is important to all of us, should be important to all of us. So thank you so much. This is being recorded, and that it will be available in a day or so. And please share that recording with whoever you think would be interested in seeing it. And I just want to mention that at the top, I think we had 57 people taking part in this call, which is really excellent. So thanks again, and thank you everybody for tuning in, I guess I can say. And indeed, if you're interested in more things like this, the Blomidon Naturalist Society, we hold monthly meetings and the odd webinar. And we take people on field trips into forests and fields, etc. So if you're not a member but would like to take part in our activities and see what we're doing, it's open to the public. And just go to the Blomidon Naturalists .ca website, and there's a link called activities, and you'll see a calendar there with everything we put on. And I might just mention that last summer, Alain gave a plant course for the BNS, and I'm hoping he will do that again.
Oh, yeah.
And we will also be putting on an Acadian forest ecology course this spring, as long as COVID doesn't raise its, let's say, ugly head even more than it has.
Who's going to put that one on?
What's that?
Who's going to host that workshop?
Riley and I, and potentially you, if you would like to take part in it.
Oh, I was just asking.
So thanks for volunteering. Anyways, thanks everybody, and stay safe.
You too. Thanks, Soren.
Thanks. Good.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks.